Making his debut is Conor Tomlinson, and he's going to discuss the planned pro-Palestinian protests scheduled for Armistice Day next Saturday, November even, the 11th. Away you go, Conor.
Yeah, so the Prime Minister has ruled out banning the pro-Palestinian protests that are scheduled to happen on the 11th of November on Armistice Day. Now, this has proven to be quite an unpopular policy, actually, because the People's Polling Company put out a poll that said 43% of Britons polled wanted the protests banned. And another third thought that if the protests went ahead, the Met Police were unequipped to stop the protests from escalating into violence. Now, why such a lack of faith in the police in our country? Well, as we've seen in various videos floating around on Twitter from prior protests in the week, they've been holding and handing back the possessions of protesters illegally scaling scaffolding. They haven't stopped them from defacing Nelson's column, but they did decide to go and arrest a man who complained about Palestinian flags being flown in Bethnal Green High Street. And the reason is they recognise that this is a volatile constituency who have supported the actions of the terrorists since the initial massacre on October the 7th. And they think by telling the British public not to antagonise them by waving English flags, they will be able to stop the tension. It's kind of like telling a battered wife, don't burn the dinner next time if you don't want to get smacked. Multiculturalism has led us to this situation. Mass immigration has led us to this situation. And more woolly liberalism that thinks we can just talk this situation out will not lead us out of it. Tolerance is not a neutral value. It is a liability if the other side doesn't reciprocate. If they declare their intention to flip over the game board, why should they be protected by the rules of the game? We already have it with embarrassing situations where the police have had to delete tweets of flags being flown, have prior been flown by the Taliban, and have told us jihad actually has many meanings engaging in Islamic theology when a proscribed terrorist group stands on the corner declaring that Muslim armies should annex England to a global caliphate. Now, I don't personally have any allegiances to Israel more than I do any other country like Iceland. I just don't want my home city every weekend turned into a no-go zone by people that fundamentally hate the English way of life. They don't believe in free speech, so why should we extend it to them? I think it would be an absolute act of disrespect to the glorious dead, the men who fought to keep our country safe in 2 world wars, if we allowed a terrorist-supporting protest to happen on their day of memorial. Ban it.
Yeah, well, Albie, do you disagree?
Yes, I do disagree, actually, Conor. You and I often have conversations about freedom of speech and how important it is in a liberal democracy. And I think that means that we can't be going around banning protests on the nationally important days, granted, but because they're inconvenient. And we've got to remember that a lot of the people on these protests, they simply want a ceasefire, like 76% of the British public, as Benjamin was telling us earlier on. So I think it would be totally wrong and a betrayal of our British liberal democratic principles to be going around banning protests on inconvenient days. Imagine what could happen if a government had that power and we didn't agree with the government.
They already do. They did it with COVID. So what we're seeing here is the ability to do...
But you didn't like that, did you?
No, I know. And this is why tolerance is not a neutral value. We either stand for our own personal values, like freedom, like free speech, or we cave to a mob that want to confiscate those. They've already said that they don't...
Ceasefire protesters don't want to confiscate our freedom.
These protests started after the initial massacre. So what they're doing is they're capitalising on a bunch of students who don't understand that a ceasefire means the death of Jews to drum up popular support.
You're saying that 76% of Brits don't know what they're talking about.
We also know that from the security services and from counter-terrorism that Iran is having quite an influence on some of these protests. I don't know exactly in what ways, presumably in terms of social media output and in terms of drumming up support from particular leaders from various communities. But there are, of course, Albie, many people who are on these marches who just want peace. Of course there are. But I think it is extremely disrespectful for people to march concerning a foreign conflict, which is so controversial and also puts so much... Well, it scares Jewish communities in this country massively, and I don't think we can overstate that, to be honest. I've spoken to a lot of Jewish people in the last couple of weeks, and they are very fearful. They're making plans in their heads of where they could possibly move to if things get too tough here, which I think is an absolute travesty. Yeah. And it's something, if I think about too much, I will start to cry about, because it is horrible. This country gave refuge to Jewish people, and we have a history of it. So I find it absolutely astonishing that people in this country would consider it even an option to have this kind of protest?
I find this a difficult one because, on the one hand, I want to say that I really dislike the idea of a protest being banned because I think our democracy ought to be strong enough to take these tests. And I think, in many ways, it certainly is. But I often make the case about hate speech and why I think there should be such laws as hate speech laws, because if your speech has a consequence that means that it stops someone else's ability to go about their normal day-to-day lives and just be themselves, then I think that's a reasonable bar to draw legally. And I would suggest, in some ways echoing what Emily just described, that if there is a motivation to do these protests in a way that has a provocation, because it's Armistice Day, that has a provocation to affect Jews feeling safe in their home city or wherever it may be in this country, then I think that probably is where it crosses the line. And of course, I would suggest that if that's not the case, then given that Armistice Day falls on a Saturday, why don't they do it on the Sunday or the following week? That might be a far more amicable conclusion.
I would say to people who are in favour of a ceasefire, don't protest on that day because it's not going to win you any favours with the people that you're trying to convince that you are right. But at the same time...
I don't think, by the way, they're trying to convince anyone they're right. They're just trying to feel righteous.
I hope they're trying to win the argument. They're not going to win the argument by protesting on Armistice Day. But I will just say something very quickly about a protest I went to the week after the Black Lives Matter protests. There was a White Lives Matter protest. I went just to go and see what it was going to be like, and it was the most terrifying experience of my life to see all these racists gathering in central London. I don't think that should have been banned. So if I don't think that should have been banned, I'm perfectly consistent to say I don't think this should be banned either.
Were they declaring their intent ahead of time?
It's better that this stuff is out in the daylight so we can tackle it.
Were they declaring their intent ahead of time to violently overthrow the culture of the country? Because we've already seen that happen at multiple prior protests. They've already had to make arrests about that. And, again, this came off the back of an act of aggression by a terrorist group. So that is the ethos that is underlying
But they're not protesting in support of Hamas. They're protesting in support of freeing Palestine and for a peace and
But not from Hamas. They aren't protesting on support of freeing Palestine from Hamas. They're saying ending the Jewish occupation there. They're not necessarily against Hamas. And that is a serious problem.
I think the majority of the protesters who are out there are not supporting Hamas. They are simply supporting what we all want, a two-state solution, and for this awful debacle to be over.
I don't think they all want that, though. I think, unfortunately, you and your good nature are giving too much goodwill to the people that are chanting from the river to the sea, implying the eradication of the Jewish state, which is in the Hamas Charter.
And, of course, there are some people who are chanting that phrase who haven't the foggiest what it actually means. So you've got a mixture of people on these marches with all sorts of different intentions.